All across Europe and the Mediterranean, from Spain to Greece to North Africa, you'll find the ruins of once majestic buildings. Evidence of a civilization that thrived for over 1,000 years and still found a way to continue even after its fall. This was Rome, an expansionist power that has been recognized and studied more than any other in history. But before it was a continent-spanning militaristic empire, it was far less, and nobody knew what it was destined to become. According to the famous foundation myth of Rome, the story starts here, on the Italian peninsula. The city of Alba Longa, part of the small community of Latin cities resting south of the Tiber River, was ruled by King Numita. The Latins claimed descent from the legendary Aeneas, a hero from the Trojan War, who left the devastated city and traveled west, settling in Italy. King Numita had an envious brother, Amulius. Younger than Numita, he would never see the throne, as Numita had many sons who were next in line. So Amulius did the only thing he could do. He had the king's sons murdered, and ran Numita himself out of the city. Numita's daughter, Rhea Silvia, was also made to become a priestess of the goddess Vesta, which would become known as a Vestal Virgin. She was to remain chaste under penalty of death, effectively killing off any chance for Numita to have another successor. Amulius was unaware, though, that Rhea Silvia was already pregnant, with twins, from the god Mars. Once they were born, Amulius ordered both to be drowned in the Tiber River. His servant brought them to the river, but it was in flood, so the babies, named Remus and Romulus, were left on the riverbank to die of exposure. It all could have ended here, if not for a she-wolf, named Lupa. She found the twins, and nursed them back to health. Soon after, a shepherd found the infants, and took them in, raising them. Once the boys became adults, they got their revenge on Amulius, deposing him and restoring Numita to the throne. The twins then set out to found a city for themselves, near the Tiber River, where they were found as infants. But Numita and Amulius' familial patterns manifested in Remus and Romulus, and they began to bicker over who should be king of this new city. To solve this problem, they asked the gods for a sign. Remus went to wait on the Aventine Hill, the hill he preferred to build the city, while Romulus waited on the Palatine Hill. Remus was the first to see a sign, 6 birds which flew by. Ancient Roman religion interpreted omens from the behavior of birds. Later on, Romulus saw 12 birds. Both believed they won, as Remus saw his sign first, but Romulus saw double the amount. Deciding to settle the dispute in a more conventional method, they came to physical blows, and during the fight, Remus was killed by his brother. Romulus then founded the city of Rome around the Palatine Hill, naming it after himself. The legendary date for this was April 21, 753 BCE. The story of Rome started here, in Italy. Italy is a peninsula, extending some 600 miles, or 960 kilometers in length, but is only 150 miles wide, giving it the appearance of a boot. A range of mountains, called the Apennines, cuts through the middle, dividing Italy. Despite these mountains, Italy was blessed with many fertile plains. The largest was in the north, the Po Valley. To the south were the plains of Latium. This is where Rome began, along with other Latin tribal villages. South of that were the plains of Campania. Italy was bounded in the east by the Adriatic Sea. Just a bit further would be the Greeks, which we recently looked at. In the west was the Tyrrhenian Sea, where lay the islands of Corsica and Sardinia. Just off the southern coast of the peninsula was Sicily, a large island that would become very important in Rome's history. Tradition holds that Rome began as a monarchy under Romulus, and was under the control of 7 kings for over 2 centuries. 2 of these kings weren't Roman at all, but Etruscan, a people predating the Indo-European people, who lived north of Rome, in Etruria. While we can't confirm the identities of any of these kings, historians agree that Rome came under the influence of the Etruscans for around a century. It's most likely that Rome developed into a city under Etruscan rule. They built roads, temples, marketplaces, and housing units. By the late 500s BCE, Rome became a true mix of Latin and Etruscan culture. In 509 BCE, Rome overthrew their monarchy and transitioned to a republic. Though the Romans resided in a geographically beneficial location, they were still surrounded by their enemies. The other Latin cities in Latium were their closest foes, and battle between them would last for more than a century. Our main historical source for this time was Livy, writing much later, during the early days of the empire. He emphasized the Romans' willpower, determination, and discipline. By 338 BCE, the Romans succeeded in their conquest of Latium and engaged in further war with the Samnites for the next few decades. After the conquest of central Italy, the Romans came into contact with the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia to the south. These Greeks had settled in southern Italy during Greece's Archaic Age. Eventually they had colonies all over the south, and on the island of Sicily. A much older culture, Greece always had an influence on Rome, either directly, or through the Etruscans, who themselves adopted much of Greek culture. Rome came to favor the Mediterranean diet of grapes and olives, and adopted the Greek alphabet. Over time, they would adopt their architecture, and other forms of art. They were no friends of Greece though, and were invaded by a general from the east, Pyrrhus of Epirus. Though he caused the Romans trouble, they rallied, and he was forced to return to the Greek mainland, leaving the southern peninsula in Roman hands. By the 260s BCE, Rome had conquered the Etruscans to the north, and was in firm control of the majority of Italy. Phase 1 of Roman domination was complete. During Roman expansion, they formed a confederation, dividing Roman rights into 3 categories. The cives had full Roman citizenship, and given all the rights of free individuals. The socii were Roman allies, and did not have citizenship rights, but had to supply soldiers for Roman campaigns. They were able to run their own territories independently. The Latini were members of the original Latin League, and regarded as half socii and half citizens. As an incentive, Rome gave their allies a pathway to full citizenship if they acted accordingly, making the conquered people feel like a part of Rome, and willing to protect it. Arguably just as effective as their diplomacy was their military. Roman expansion came with inevitable rebellions, which were subdued fairly quickly. While they expanded, they also built new colonies in new territory, and sent garrisons to strategic locations. They used roads to connect Rome to these garrisons and created a network of quick communication and troop transport. As Rome grew throughout Italy, their policies gave them access to more and more soldiers, and they became stronger. At the head of the republic were the consuls, considered the executive branch, and praetors, which were judicial. Each year, 2 consuls were chosen to administer the government, and lead the army into battle. According to Livy, the office of praetor was created in 367 BCE, and was in charge of civil law, but was also in charge when the consuls were unavailable. Though originally only dealing with Roman citizens, another praetor was eventually added, who dealt with non-citizens. The government was also filled with other officials, who handled other matters like finances. Apart from these, was the Roman Senate, which grew to be the most important and dominant part of the Republic. It originally consisted of 300 elderly men, or senes, who served for life. Their duty was as an advisory council. Though they existed since the founding of Rome, they truly reached their apex during the middle of the Republic, but would become less important with time. The Republic was also run by assemblies, who acted as the legislative branch. One of these was the Centuriate Assembly, who dealt with military affairs. It was based on wealth, and was deliberately organized in such a way as to maintain the status quo, and keep the powerful in place. They elected magistrates and passed laws. The Tribal Assembly was a non-military assembly, and elected different magistrates. It was more democratic, and fairer to the lower classes than the Centuriate Assembly. The Roman Republic was run by these 3 main bodies. The executive magistrates, which included the consuls and praetors. The assemblies, like the centuriate and tribal, who elected the magistrates, and the Senate, wealthy landowners, who acted as advisors. These wealthy Romans represented the patricians, one of the two main social divisions in Rome. The patricians were descended from the original senators who made up the aristocratic class during the preceding Roman kingdom period. Only the patricians were allowed to be magistrates and senators. They were also mostly represented in the centuriate assembly. The plebeians were a much larger group, and also included less wealthy landowners, farmers, and other members of the middle and lower classes, like artisans and merchants. Those citizens, the plebs, would not share the same rights as the patricians. Intermarriage between the classes was forbidden, and plebeians could not be elected as government officials. From around 500 BCE, soon after the start of the Republic, the plebeians began to fight for equal rights. After the plebeian soldiers went on strike, they won an important political fight, and a new popular assembly was created in 471 BCE, the Council of the Plebs. This assembly was open only to the plebeian class, and they were given new officials, called plebeian tribunes, who were given significant powers in checking both the magistrates and senate. The struggle between plebeian and patrician, known as the conflict of the orders, would continue on, with the plebs gaining more rights along the way, like intermarriage with an upper class, and being able to be elected consul. In 287 BCE, the Council of the Plebs won the right to pass laws. This marked the end of the conflict of the orders. Though the struggle lasted centuries, the plebeians eventually gained equal rights to the patricians, but in practice, Rome was never a true democracy, nor was it meant to be. Around this time, Rome had completed their consolidation of Italy, and now faced a new challenge: the masters of the Western Mediterranean. The city of Carthage was founded in North Africa around 814 BCE, by the Phoenicians, a civilization we've mentioned at the start of this series. Over the years, Carthage grew, and created an empire of their own in the West Mediterranean. By the mid-200s, they had expanded to include territory on the coast of North Africa, southern Spain, the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, and most importantly, the western part of Sicily. So close to the Italian peninsula, Rome was wary of the Carthaginian presence, and the first of a series of wars would begin in 264 BCE. This First Punic War was Rome's attempt to conquer Sicily. This was almost impossible without a navy, and while the Romans were adept land fighters, they had no fleet. Using the remains of a Carthaginian shipwreck as a blueprint, the Romans created their own navy. The Romans eventually beat the Carthaginians, and in 241 BCE, Carthage gave up its holdings on Sicily, and had to pay an indemnity. Sicily then became Sicilia, the first of Rome's provinces. Corsica and Sardinia became provinces soon after. Rome was still considered a mere annoyance in a Mediterranean, dominated by Carthage in the west, and the Greek world in the east, but the Carthaginians slowly planned revenge. Under their greatest general, Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginians struck at the pro-Roman city of Saguntum, in Spain, triggering the Second Punic War, in 218 BCE. His strategy was to attack Rome itself, and end the Republic for good. Instead of attacking them by sea, Hannibal came from the west, marching across the Alps, to attack Rome from the north. His army was most likely just under 50,000, and had success against the Roman armies on his way. The most famous was at Cannae, where the Romans lost almost 50,000 men, and had almost 20,000 captured. The Romans were known for their fighting spirit, and would often fight their best when all seemed lost, so they regrouped, and slowly pushed back the advance. By 206, the Romans successfully expelled the Carthaginian armies from Italy. They then went on the offensive, and attacked Carthage directly. In 202 BCE, the Romans decisively defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, effectively ending the war. A year later, with the peace treaty, Spain became another Roman province, and Rome earned its place as the new master of the Western Mediterranean. A half-century later, in 149 BCE, Rome put the final nail in the coffin. After catching Carthage in a technical breach of their treaty, Rome attacked, a move pushed by their more aggressive politicians, like Cato. This Third Punic War lasted only 3 years, and by 146 BCE, Carthage was destroyed, buildings were razed, and over 50,000 were sold into slavery. The Carthaginian territory was then made into the Roman province of Africa. While the Romans finally got rid of the nuisance of Carthage, they would then turn east, to the Greek world of the East Mediterranean. They had been wars with these states since 214 BCE, what were known as the Macedonian Wars, but it wasn't until 148 that the Romans finally conquered Macedonia, making it another province. The Greek city-states to the south fell in 146 at the Battle of Corinth, and became part of Macedon. They continued east, and in 133 BCE, Rome conquered Pergamon, which became the province of Asia, the Romans' first province on this continent. With their two main enemies out of the way, Rome became the Mediterranean's hegemonic power. To win these decisive fights, they relied on an experienced army. The largest military unit in Rome was the legion. The four main legions each consisted of around 4,200 to 5,200 infantry, and 300 equites, or cavalry. Early on in the Republic, soldiers were citizens between 18 and 46, who could provide their own equipment. As most were farmers, they were able to harvest part-time, and be free to march the rest of the year. During the Punic Wars, the Romans needed to recruit larger armies, and the number of legions grew to 23. Over time, this number would continue to grow wildly. By the mid-100s BCE, Rome had quelled all external threats, but it failed to take control of its internal tensions. By this time, the senator's power was at its apex, and these 300 aristocrats accrued power of foreign, domestic, and financial policy. Over time, the small minority of wealthy landowners bought both the state-owned lands and lands from the smaller farmers, creating large estates for themselves, run by slave labor, called latifundia. With the rise of these estates, the farmers declined, leading to less people able to provide military service. These smaller farmers often had to then migrate to the larger urban centers, becoming part of a growing landless poor. This led two men, the Gracchus brothers, to attempt to fix the growing economic problems and social unrest. They focused on a solution from the ground up, recognizing that helping those less fortunate would help the entirety of Rome. They used the Council of the Plebs to bypass the wealthy Senate, and called for land reforms, shifting aristocratic land back into the hands of the government and then redistribute it to the poor. This was to revitalize the number of small farmers, the backbone of Roman society. The agrarian reform laws didn't go well with the senators, many of which were landowners themselves, and in 133 BCE, they murdered Tiberius Gracchus, one of the brothers. In 121 BCE, Gaius Gracchus, his younger brother, was also assassinated, a grim foreshadowing for any who wished to change the status quo. During the late Republic, Marius, who held the consulship from 104 to 100 BCE, reformed the military structure. As mentioned earlier, the Roman army had always consisted of smaller farmers who owned land, and were able to go on campaign part-time through the year. Marius instead recruited landless volunteers from both the urban and rural areas. He supplied his army directly, and promised them land in return. Over time, armies would not only become more professional, but would instill their loyalty to their general, as opposed to the state. Because of this, military generals, backed by their armies, would soon come to hold much more power in Rome, and eventually become a destabilizing force for the Republic. Sulla was the first general to take advantage of the Marian reforms, with immediate destabilizing results. He had been fighting a war in Anatolia, but when the Council of the Plebs transferred the war command to Marius, Sulla marched on Rome. He represented the optimates, those who wanted to keep senatorial power over the populist reforms of the populares, headed by Marius. This sparked the first widespread civil war, and by 82 BCE, Sulla came out as the victor. He became dictator, and purged all his enemies and opposition. He gave back power to the Senate and limited the powers of the assemblies, including the council of the plebs and their tribunes. Though Sulla believed he was protecting a future for a traditional Rome, his actions marked the start of the fall of the Republic. The next decades in Rome would be plagued by civil wars, as numerous powerful men sought after glory. The beginning of the end came around 60 BCE, under a coalition of 3 men, which we call the First Triumvirate, ruled by 3 individuals. Crassus was often cited as the richest man in Rome, and gained more political prominence after victory over a slave revolt, which we will discuss later. Crassus also created Rome's first fire brigade. At the first sign of fire, his men would rush to the scene, but refuse to put it out, unless the owner of the property sold it to Crassus first. If they refused, Crassus would let the building burn. If they accepted, Crassus fixed up the property, and then leased it back to the original owner. This is how he came to accumulate most of the property in Rome. Pompey the Great, an epithet taken after his hero Alexander the Great, had served under Sulla, and was a ruthless military general, serving as commander in wars in Spain, along with many other campaigns. The third of the triumvirate was a man named Gaius Julius Caesar. Born to a patrician family, Caesar lived out his teenage years in hiding, after Sulla won the civil war. As a young man, Caesar was kidnapped by pirates, who demanded a ransom of 20 talents, but Caesar, knowing his worth, insisted they ask for 50 instead. He was quite relaxed with his captors, even jesting that once he was free, he would raise a navy and come back to crucify them all. When his ransom was paid, he made good on his joke, but when he caught up with the pirates, he took mercy on them, and had their throats cut instead. By the 60s BCE, Caesar had a military command in Spain as well. Over time, these 3 men accrued more power. Pompey continued his command in Spain, while Crassus was given a command in the east, in the wealthy Syrian region. And Caesar was given a command in Gaul, and pursued his own campaigns there. Crassus was killed in 53 BCE, while attempting to fight the Parthians, an Iranian empire that had annexed most of the former Seleucid territories. This left Pompey and Caesar in direct competition with each other. Caesar had managed to conquer and annex all of France from the Gauls, and was hailed as a hero. The Gauls were part of the Celtic peoples which originated in Central Europe, and spread to live mainly in the region of present-day France and Belgium. They were spread out in different tribes, and often lived in large fortified settlements known as oppida. Rome was already familiar with the Gauls, as they had been at war with them for centuries, ever since they sacked and occupied the city for months, back in 390 BCE. Brennus made sure to utterly humiliate the Romans. Over 3 centuries later, Julius Caesar returned the favor, defeating Vercingetorix, leader of the Gaulish Confederation, and winning the Gallic Wars. Not only did he become wealthy and famous, his army gained valuable experience, and was more loyal than ever. Pompey aligned himself with the Optimates, and the Senate voted that Caesar relieve his post, and return to Rome as a regular citizen. Caesar refused, and in 49 BCE, returned with his army, crossing the Rubicon, an outer river boundary of Rome that no army was allowed to pass, and seized control of the city. This began a 4-year political and military conflict, known as Caesar's Civil War, between those loyal to Caesar and those loyal to Pompey. Pompey himself was an adept general, but after fleeing to Egypt, he was assassinated by the Ptolemaic king, just a year into the conflict. Caesar defeated Pompey's allies by 45 BCE, and a year later, became dictator for life, a move that directly threatened the upper classes. He continued estranging the Optimates by enacting reforms, giving land to the poor, and increasing the number of Senate members to 900. He also reformed the old Roman calendar to create the Julian calendar, which remained predominant in the Western world for over 1600 years. In a way mirroring Alexander the Great, Caesar had much success in the West, and planned campaigns to the East, but was assassinated by a group of senators, and his ambitions ended there. A second triumvirate was then formed, between 3 new men, composed of Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's 2 biggest supporters. They defeated Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, and then divided the Roman world between them. This wouldn't last though, and Lepidus was exiled in 36 BCE, leaving Octavian with his territories, and the west, and Antony with the east. Antony's hatred and jealousy of Caesar's relative set the two men on the course for another civil war. Mark Antony allied himself with the Ptolemies, marrying Caesar's former lover, Cleopatra VII, wishing to use Egypt as a base to capture Rome. In 31 BCE, Octavian's forces decisively defeated the combined navies of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. A year later, he followed them to Egypt, and at the Battle of Alexandria, both Mark Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Egypt was annexed as the province of Roman Egypt. This marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the end of the only surviving of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Standing above all was Octavian, grandnephew of Julius Caesar, the man who would finally restore the Republic. Or so it seemed. In 27 BCE, Octavian appealed for normalcy, announcing a return to the Republic, but his popularity and control over the army made him sole ruler of Rome. The Senate themselves gave him the title of Augustus, meaning majestic or revered, a title only fit for a god. He was also given the title of Imperator, where we get the word emperor from. We consider the birth of the Roman Empire to have begun here, with a period called the Principate, a time where the emperors maintained the illusion of stability and the maintenance of ideals from the Republic. Octavian, now known as Caesar Augustus, disbanded many of the legions from the civil wars, but kept 28 of them as a standing army, around 150,000 men. These citizen soldiers were accompanied by a similar number of auxiliary troops, taken from the non-citizen population. In addition to the Roman army, he kept a private army of around 6,000 men as bodyguards. They were called the Praetorian Guard, and they would eventually become quite influential in propping up or tearing down future emperors. Augustus first expanded the empire north, taking the small territory of Raetia in present-day Austria and Switzerland, and to the east, into Illyricum, which are a group of Balkan countries today. He then tried to conquer Germania and the Germanic tribes that lay across the Rhine. This task fell to General Varus, who was given a force of 3 legions. But in year 9 CE, the Roman army was ambushed, and of their reported 22,000 troops, 14 to 20,000 of them were slaughtered. The leader of the Germanic Confederation, Arminius, was a Roman citizen, with a Roman education, and was sent to aid Varus in his conquest of Germania. Arminius and other auxiliary troops were able to secretly counter the offensive and stay one step ahead of the Romans. This battle of the Teutoburg Forest devastated Augustus and halted his expansion campaigns. Rome wouldn't interfere with the Germanic people again for almost 200 years. The tribes remained independent and were always the closest threat to Rome on the continent. Augustus died just 5 years later, in year 14. His long reign of 45 years cemented the continuance of the empire. Though the facade of the Republic remained, Augustus was by all means an autocrat, but his successful propaganda and appeals to tradition satisfied a Roman people who had just been through the destabilizing era of civil wars from the late Republic. After his death, Augustus was replaced with his stepson Tiberius, second emperor of Rome. Augustus, Tiberius, and their 3 successors would form the first dynasty of the Roman Empire, the Julio-Claudians. The dynasty would hold power until year 68. Under this dynasty, the amount of power Augustus had given to the Senate slowly drifted away and into the emperor's hands. They expanded their own governments and bureaucracy, hiring whomever they wished. Corruption steadily increased, and by the end of this dynasty, Nero was depicted by historians like Tacitus as greedy and corrupt, and even blamed for starting the Great Fire of Rome in year 64. Nero also persecuted much of the population, and is even suspected of having his own mother murdered. Though the senators had little power, regional governors rebelled, and the Praetorian Guard abandoned him. With nowhere to turn, he either committed suicide or had an aide kill him. With his death came the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and the beginning of a period of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Out of this came the next dynasty, the Flavians. The Flavian dynasty were short-lived, ruling from 69 to 96, and consisted of just 3 emperors, Vespasian and his 2 sons. Massive construction projects were commissioned under the Flavians, the most noteworthy being the Flavian Amphitheatre. Once Domitian was assassinated in 96, the Nerva Antonine dynasty took power. The first handful of these 7 emperors were known as the 5 Good Emperors because of their tolerance and diplomatic skills. Though Rome had entered a golden age under Augustus, called the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, it truly reached its height under the 5 Good Emperors. Rome expanded regularly, and internally, it was prosperous and stable. Though the emperors of this dynasty failed to produce male heirs, they instead adopted men able to lead and keep the empire stable. The emperor's power grew even more during this time, while the Senate suffered. Under Trajan, the second of the 5 Good Emperors, social welfare programs were expanded, and he oversaw Rome at its greatest territorial extent by the time of his death in 117. It covered 5 million square kilometers, almost as large as Alexander's gigantic Macedonian Empire a few centuries earlier. Both Trajan and his successor Hadrian were praised for their extensive building projects as well. Trajan's most known landmarks are Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Market, and Trajan's Column. Hadrian built the Temple of Venus and Roma, thought to be the largest temple in Rome, and rebuilt the Pantheon, a temple that was dedicated to all the gods. This building still stands today. After Trajan's death, Hadrian realized the empire was overextended and took a more defensive approach. He withdrew from the eastern territories, like Mesopotamia and parts of Arabia, and focused on building defenses in Europe. He fortified borders on the Rhine and Danube, and built a wall in Roman Britain, Hadrian's Wall, to separate the Romans from Caledonia, and the Picts and Gales which lived to the north. The Roman armies lived in permanent fortifications and outposts behind their borders, and had an efficient system to transport reinforcements to other outposts with haste. When the Stoic emperor, Marcus Aurelius, died in 180, the period of the 5 Good Emperors ended, and the Pax Romana along with it. With the murder of Commodus 12 years later in 192, the Nerva Antonine dynasty was also over, leading to another short period of instability, this time called the Year of the 5 Emperors. The Roman Empire experienced its height around the same time as Han China, in the 2nd century, which we covered in our overview of ancient China. The empire had reached a population of 60 to 75 million, though only a fraction of these were full citizens. It wasn't until 212, under Caracalla, that citizenship was given to all free inhabitants of the empire, a move that made residents everywhere feel more connected to Rome, and as a consequence, also raised tax revenues. Roman culture spread all through the Mediterranean, mixing with the existing Hellenistic culture already in place since Alexander, creating a new Greco-Roman culture. Latin was mainly used in the Western Empire, and Greek in the East. Because the empire was highly centralized, the provincial governors had very little manpower, and needed to rely on the smaller city officials to carry out the routine affairs, especially tax collection. Despite the East having more urban centers, creating a denser population, the West always had a higher total population, with inhabitants living in smaller cities and settlements. During the Pax Romana, trade also blossomed, and is the main reason for Rome's prosperity during its first 2 centuries of existence. Traders from around the empire would sail to Italy, to ports at the Bay of Naples and on the Tiber. More importantly, traders would come from beyond the empire's borders, like from China. Both empires were similar in that they had originally built their road systems to mobilize their military. A fortunate consequence of this was that it facilitated trade. Traders would have routes they could follow, which would be safe from raiders and thieves. The most important of these was called the Silk Road. In reality, the Silk Road wasn't just a singular road, but a series of silk routes, creating a web of passages over the land and sea that connected China to India, to Central Asia, the Middle East, East Africa, and Europe. China had been extracting silk from silkworm cocoons for thousands of years already, but it wasn't until the Roman Republic that silk exports reached the Mediterranean. By the time of the Empire and the Pax Romana, silk was flowing into Rome and became a luxury item. It was very popular with the elites, but as silk flowed in, silver flowed out. It was reported that the treasuries were running low because of the amount of silk Roman women would purchase. Though Rome and China had commercial contact, there hasn't been any reported political contact between the Roman Empire and the Han. This could be because of the two Central Asian empires separating them, the Parthians and Kushan. As Rome dismantled the Hellenistic kingdoms in the west, the Parthians and Kushan dismantled them in the east, and both empires were successful, lasting for centuries. Egypt also became a hotbed for trade. Egyptian merchants would open up ports in India and import pearls and spices for the wealthy. Trade was also widely used for Roman industry. Though most material products were made in the Greek East since Hellenistic times, the Latin West reached a high point in manufacturing, especially Italy. The rural regions kept the empire running, and from there, Rome's most essential industry, agriculture. The large estates of the latifundia were the crux of Rome's agricultural output, and were prevalent in the south of Italy and on Sicily. Pliny the Elder, an author in the early Roman Empire, was dismayed by the sheer amount of slave labor used on these farms, and not the small farmers which were the nucleus of the army. Tenant farmers would sometimes work the latifundia with slaves, and paid the landowner in either labor or crops. Smaller farmers would still prosper to the north though, in Etruria and the fertile Po Valley. What made Rome so unique was their ability to use certain parts of other cultures to their advantage. Their early land army adopted aspects of the Samnite military which almost defeated them during their expansion in Italy, and their navy was based off of Carthaginian ships during the First Punic War. While both civilizations were ultimately defeated, that can't be said for the Greeks. To paraphrase the Roman poet Horace, though Greece was conquered, it was the Greek culture that captured Rome. This was apparent early on in the empire under Augustus, during what historians call the Golden Age of Latin literature. One of the most famous poets from this time was Virgil. He was born in northern Italy, and was credited for composing the three most famous poems in Latin literature. His most famous work was the Aeneid, an epic poem written in honor of Augustus. In the Aeneid, a Trojan named Aeneas flees the sacking of Troy, and travels to Italy, becoming an ancestor to the Romans. This created a direct link between Greek history and the Romans, and legitimized Augustus and his descendants. Aeneas was portrayed as having faithfulness and duty. Just like Homer's Iliad was used as a model for Greek consciousness, the Aeneid gave the Romans purpose as a divine empire, and is regarded as one of the greatest works of Latin literature. Just like literature, the Romans also took Greek inspiration for their art and architecture. They constructed statues in the Greek style, and placed them all over the public, and even private homes. The main differences between the Greek and Roman style was that classical Greek statues were more calm and detached, more idealized versions of the human body, while the Romans had a more natural style, depicting more realistic facial features and emotions. In the more wealthy homes, were frescoes of beautiful landscapes and paintings from mythology. Romans did use Greek architecture in their designs, like colonnades, adapted them from earlier Greek Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns into their own style. Taking what they needed from the Greeks, they improved on it greatly. When Augustus came to power, he rebuilt large parts of the imperial city, so engineers and architects flocked to Rome from all over Europe, leading to a Roman architectural revolution. There was a new widespread use of innovative structures, like arches, vaults, which acted as ceilings, and domes. Their massive erections were able to be built because of one crucial invention, which they called opus cementitium, or Roman concrete. This became the primary building material after the traditional stone and brick. With this substance, and their superb engineering skills, they created some of the most magnificent structures of the classical age, including public baths, large amphitheaters, mausoleums, and temples. They also improved the infrastructure, building a vast network of roads in the empire, all of which led back to Rome. Rome also had 11 aqueducts, which successfully supplied water to the city's vast population, and these were built to last, some even still in operation today. Roman law was a series of legal systems that spanned over 1,000 years. It began in the early days of the Republic, in 449 BCE, with the 12 Tables, written by the Decemvirs, and were thought to be influenced by the laws of Solon, written in Greece a century earlier. The laws would evolve over time, becoming more beneficial for the plebeian class. By the time of the empire, the law code was updated to deal with the intricate problems in a vast empire. Jus civile, or citizen law, was the body of laws that applied to Roman citizens. Jus gentium, or laws of the peoples, was the set of laws for foreigners and their dealings with citizens. It was part of the jus naturale, or natural law, a universal law which applied to all people, and was used to explain why all people, despite their location, naturally follow certain laws. From Roman law came the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, thought to have originated during the era of the good emperors. This meant judges had to more carefully examine the evidence before rendering a verdict. Presumption of innocence would continue on, along with many other facets of Roman law, to become the basis for European law and legal culture. The basic unit in Roman society was the family. It was headed by the paterfamilias, or male head of the household. Families were close to the nuclear style, where the head had a wife and children, but could often include their sons' wives, and slaves as well. Like in Greece, Roman women needed to rely on their male guardians. If the paterfamilias died, his duties would pass on to his son, or closest male relatives. Fathers arranged marriages for their daughters. In the early Republic, elite families would perform manus marriage, where the father hands off his daughter to her new husband, so she would always be under some form of male power. During the time of Julius Caesar and the late Republic, this was changed to a free marriage, in which the father retained his legal control over her. This gave women more power, as they lived with a husband with no direct control. Usually, the father would also meet his death sooner than his daughter and her husband, granting her a type of independence, leading to some very prominent and powerful women in Rome. Though marriage and reproduction was promoted, infant mortality was quite high, up to 1 in 3, often the lower classes. In the upper classes, the role of the father was to make sure his children were educated. While girls were taught to be homemakers and good wives and mothers, the boys would learn to read and write, and learn the law and moral systems of the state. They would also engage in regular physical activity and training to become soldiers. Once they turned 16, boys would trade in their purple-striped toga, the toga praetexta, with the toga virilis, or the plain white toga of manhood. Originally, the paterfamilias theoretically had the legal power of life and death over every member of the family, but was expected to act as a proper citizen. During the 2nd century, he began to lose most of his powers over his family, and his control was finally limited. By the end of the century, women were no longer required to have male guardians. Upper-class women always had more independence than the lower classes. They could go where they pleased, and attend the races and events at the amphitheater. Though those women of the higher classes couldn't participate in politics directly, they exerted their influence through the males closest to them, their husbands and sons. Livia was quite influential, through her husband Emperor Augustus. She allegedly had various members of his family killed, and convinced him to adopt her son, Tiberius, who became the 2nd Roman emperor after Augustus died. Though it's been established that slavery was a regular part of the ancient world, it had never reached the scale of Rome. Rome not only had more slaves than any other civilization, they were also entirely dependent on this slave labor. The richest Romans usually had the most slaves, and it came to be seen as a symbol of stature. The most prestigious slaves would be Greek, and acted as tutors, musicians, and artists. But the main crux of slaves were farm laborers, who worked in deplorable conditions. They would also work inside the home as cooks, cleaners, and gardeners. Slaves were also used to build Rome's infrastructure, their roads, and aqueducts. Slaves all had different kinds of relationships with their masters. Some came to bond with them, but slaves were mostly treated poorly, often beaten, severely punished, abused, or simply made to labor far too long and far too hard. There were reports of individual slaves rebelling and killing their masters, reminding other owners to become wary of their own. Large slave revolts would eventually occur, called the Servile Wars. The first two took place on Sicily. The Third Servile War, from 73 to 71 BCE, is the most famous, and occurred on the peninsula, directly threatening Rome. One of the leaders of this revolt was a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus. It was eventually dismantled by Crassus, as we earlier alluded to, and 6,000 of the survivors were publicly crucified. Even the lower-class free citizens suffered, as there was a rather large disparity between rich and poor in imperial Rome. The rich lived in extravagant villas, either in the city or countryside. The poorer masses lived in cramped conditions, on city blocks called insulae. Later, this term would be used for the small apartment buildings that rested on these streets. They were built with concrete, but were hastily made, and often collapsed. Wooden beams, and the presence of candles, stoves, and lamps, were a constant fire hazard. Because the city blocks were so compact, a fire became cataclysmic. The Great Fire of Rome, in year 64, destroyed 2/3 of the city. But even with the apartments working as intended, it was still a desolate experience. Rents were so high that entire families had to share a single room. Without indoor plumbing, this led people to spend the majority of their time outdoors. Augustus and later emperors took on the responsibility of providing grain to the urban masses, called the grain dole. Grain was imported from Sicily and North Africa, and around 200,000 Roman citizens would receive free or subsidized grain. Though helpful, this still didn't alleviate the dismal conditions, and high rates of children still developed conditions caused by dietary deficiencies. The plebs had lost all their governmental power with the end of the Republic, and the empire appeased them just enough to avoid widespread uprising. The plebeians were concerned with only two things: bread and circuses. The empire provided just enough bread to survive, and provided public spectacles to entertain the masses. These were part of religious festivals, and included theater performances, and breathtaking events at the Circus Maximus. Horse and chariot races brought in tens of thousands of spectators. The biggest and most popular of the spectacles were the gladiator shows. They would take place in the amphitheaters, like the Colosseum, which could hold over 50,000 spectators. The gladiator games focused on trained fighters, battling to the death. Early on, they were usually prisoners of war, like the neighboring Samnites, Gauls, or Thracians. There were many forms and classes of gladiators, using different weapons and paraphernalia. There were also female gladiators, called a gladiatrix, but they aren't as well documented. Apart from the gladiator fights, the shows would also force unarmed criminals, both young and old, to fight wild animals. Different types of animals were also pit against each other. Before the gladiators took stage, there would be staged hunts, displaying the killing of many wild animals. Some of the animals fought directly with gladiators, and some would even kill their hunters. Wolves were treated differently than other beasts because of their religious importance. According to Emperor Trajan, the free grain satiated the individual, while the public spectacles satiated the masses. After the short disorder of the year of the 5 emperors, the Severan dynasty restored stability in 193, with a more militaristic reign. It was founded by Septimius Severus, the first emperor of African descent, but the dynasty remained in constant political turmoil. According to Cassius Dio, another major historian and senator, Emperor Elagabalus delighted in being called queen, and wanted women's genitalia, and is regarded today as the first transgender emperor. By the time of the death of the last Severan emperor in 235, the empire immediately fell into chaos again. The next 49 years saw the Roman Empire fraught with instability, corruption, and fragmentation which threatened its very existence. These decades are known as the crisis of the 3rd century, and saw at least 26 different emperors claim the throne, with most of them dying from war, assassination, suicide, or disease. Externally, the new Sassanid Empire, a Neo-Persian empire that supplanted the Parthian, invaded from the east, while Germanic tribes invaded in the west. By 268, the empire had been split, with the provinces of Gaul, Britannia, and briefly Hispania breaking away as the Gallic Empire in the west, and the provinces of Syria, Palestina, Arabia, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia as the Palmyrene Empire. Because of the widespread invasions, internal wars, and the plague of Cyprian beginning in 249, Rome's economy collapsed, and the empire nearly did as well. There was a decline in manufacturing and trade, and the plague caused a shortage of manpower in the army and agricultural sectors. Inflation soared, and Rome wasn't able to pay more soldiers to enlist. The territories were eventually reconsolidated by Emperor Aurelian. He first dealt with Queen Zenobia, ruler of the Palmyrene Empire, and then turned west to dismantle the Gallic Empire. The crisis finally ended in 284, with the ascension of Diocletian and his reforms. Under the new emperor, many of Rome's problems remained, but through Diocletian and one of his successors, Constantine, imperial power was strengthened, administrative powers were extended, and the army expanded. This was the beginning of the Dominate, a more despotic, autocratic phase of the Roman Empire that broke away from the Principate appearances of the Republic and made clear the emperor was master, or dominus. The first phase of recovery saw Diocletian appoint a co-emperor named Maximian to rule in the west, while Diocletian ruled in the east. In 293, this became a tetrarchy, with each gaining a Caesar, or junior emperor, dividing the empire into 4. Civil wars would erupt between the divided empire, and by 324 was reunified under Constantine, dissolving the tetrarchy and standing tall as the sole emperor of Rome. To celebrate his victory, Constantine built a new capital on the old Greek city of Byzantium, on the Bosphorus. The location was chosen for its strategic importance, which in hindsight proved true. He commissioned all the major Roman constructions, like a forum, circus, amphitheater, and palaces. He called this city New Rome, but it would come to be known as Constantinople, after the emperor. Diocletian and Constantine's reforms stopped the bleeding, but the majesty of the empire couldn't be revived. Upon the death of Constantine, the empire began to divide itself once again, and though Emperor Theodosius held it together, by the time of his death in 395, it was split once again into East and West, never to be joined again. While the Eastern Roman Empire, which modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, thrived, the Western Roman Empire devolved into an administrative abyss. The process began with the Germanic migrations, which had begun much earlier. The earlier Romans had set up garrisons and had been able to protect their borders, often dealing with the barbarians by absorbing them into the empire. But a new threat was on the horizon. From the east came the Huns. They were a tribe of nomads hailing from Central Asia. It's thought they were related to the Xiongnu, a menace to the Han Empire in the east. They charged into Europe from the east, causing the Goths, a Germanic tribe, to flee south and settle in Roman territory as their allies. They eventually revolted, and met the Eastern Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, and defeated them, killing the Eastern Emperor. These Goths then moved west, and would be known as Western Goths, or Visigoths. Those Goths who stayed in the east, under the rule of the Huns, were Eastern Goths, or Ostrogoths. The Visigoths marched on Rome and sacked the imperial city in 410, later traveling west to southern Gaul and settling in Spain. These weren't the only Germanic tribes on the move because of the Huns. The Vandals, an East Germanic tribe, who inhabited the territory of present-day Poland, also fled west, crossing into North Africa from Spain, and then north to sack Rome in 455. By this point, the Western Roman provinces were occupied and controlled by the Germanic tribes as their own kingdoms. In a reeling Rome, the Western emperor only appeared in control, but real power tended to be wielded by high-ranked military men. In 476, Odoacer, a high-ranked soldier and statesman of Germanic origin, deposed the last emperor. This is seen by most historians as the end of the Western Roman Empire, the fall of a Rome that ironically ended with the reign of Romulus Augustulus, a name derived from both the founder of the city and the founder of the empire. Since its founding, Rome worshipped a pantheon of gods, derived from Etruscan and Greek. The Roman pantheon included gods like Mars, the god of war, and Minerva, goddess of wisdom and justice. The entire pantheon was headed by Jupiter Optimus Maximus, god of the sky and thunder. He became the Roman patron god and was central to religious life in the city. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, a sacred eternal fire tended by her priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. The Vestals weren't bound by the same obligations like other women, and were prohibited from marriage and bearing children. They also had to take a 30-year vow of chastity, to devote themselves to fulfilling their religious duties. The Romans attributed their imperialist success to their appeasement of the gods. Though the Romans took their own religion seriously, they were also generally quite tolerant of other religions in the empire, allowing natives to worship their own deities. Romans also took certain religious aspects from these cultures, like the imperial cult from ancient Egyptian religion. Starting with Augustus, the Roman emperors would be worshipped as gods themselves. As with the Greeks, the Romans practiced many mystery religions, performing rites in an attempt for salvation or eternal life. One of these was the cult of Cybele, which the Romans called Magna Mater, or Great Mother, and who is thought to have originated in the Neolithic, evolving from this very statue type. Though the Romans didn't participate in these rituals, priests of this cult would castrate themselves in a fit of ecstasy, offering their fertility to the mother goddess. Another mystery religion was Mithraism. It might have been inspired from the Zoroastrian god Mithra, but remade into a different deity. From the beginning of the empire, this cult was quite popular among the Roman army, and spread all throughout the Western Empire, as far as Britain. And during the late Empire, Emperor Aurelian established the cult of Sol Invictus as the official religion. As the Romans advanced further east during the late Republic, they came into contact with another religion and culture, Judaism. The Seleucid Empire had been declining and losing territory for centuries by this point. Pompey, before forming the First Triumvirate, was the final nail in the coffin, dissolving the Seleucid Empire for good in 63 BCE. Fresh off this campaign, he stayed in the region, and went south to Judea. Prior to this, the territory had been part of the Seleucid Empire, but became independent after the Maccabean revolt. By 140 BCE, it was led independently by the Jewish Hasmonean dynasty, until the arrival of Pompey. He laid siege to Jerusalem, and made Judea a semi-autonomous client state, still ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty. After they allied with the Parthians, Jerusalem was besieged once again, in 37 BCE, by Herod the Great, who was appointed King of the Jews by the Roman Senate. The siege deposed the last Hasmonean king, who was then executed by the Romans. Herod then established his own kingdom. By year 6, Judea became a Roman province, directly administered by Rome through a governor. According to Josephus, a Roman Jewish historian, there were 4 different Jewish sects living in Judea at the time of the Roman occupation. The Pharisees were the largest of the groups, and believed in both the oral law, those laws given to Moses through their God, and the laws of the Torah, or written law. The Sadducees, the second sect, was an upper class of priests, and opposed the Pharisees, rejecting the oral law, instead only using the Torah. They were also open to the Hellenistic culture, the Greek culture brought in by Alexander's conquests, which the Pharisees opposed. The Essenes were the third sect, and emerged in opposition to the first 2. They left Jerusalem, preferring to dwell in the desert, living a life of asceticism. There, they prayed for a Messiah to save them from their new conquerors. The Zealots were the fourth sect and were more extreme than the other groups. They were militant and even punished other Jews for obeying certain Roman laws. They were the leading cause of the Great Jewish Revolt in 66 CE, which led to yet another siege of Jerusalem, and the destruction of the Holy City and its Second Temple. This Second Temple, ordered to be rebuilt by Cyrus the Great, had been completed since 516 BCE, after the Jews returned home from the Babylonian captivity. But decades earlier, while Augustus was living his life of opulence, another had been born, in a more humble setting. He was from Galilee, during the time of Herod's dynasty. His Hebrew name was Yeshua, and would be known as Jesus in English. Galilee was home to many of the militant zealots that opposed Roman rule. Jesus acted as a more passive force, preaching that compliance to the Roman laws was irrelevant, and that it was the laws of the soul that mattered. Treat your neighbor as you wish to be treated, and love them as you would love yourself. Humility and charity were at the forefront of his teachings. In the eyes of Rome, Jesus was a rabble-rouser, and might become a powerful revolutionary. Many Jews had already been awaiting salvation, and if they viewed Jesus as their Messiah, it could cause severe unrest in the empire. Jesus was then persecuted by both the Jews and Romans, and Pontius Pilate, governor of the Judean province, ordered his crucifixion either in 30 or 33. Soon, there was word that Jesus had escaped death and been resurrected, with witnesses saying they saw him ascend to heaven. The resurrection became central to the beliefs of who would later be called Christian. Jesus was claimed to be the anointed Savior, or Messiah, who was meant to one day return. Christianity wasn't initially seen as a separate religion from Judaism, and they were treated similarly by Rome. Paul of Tarsus, an early Christian, preached the message of Jesus to not only other Jews, but to non-Jews, who they called Gentiles. The message incorporated earlier Jewish stories, and claimed that Jesus had been sent as a savior to all people, who were all sinners because of Adam's original sin in the Garden of Eden. Once Jesus died, it was an atonement for human sin, and everyone could be saved, so long as they accept Jesus as their savior. Early on, Christianity was mainly spread orally, through sermons and preaching, but there were also written works. Texts at the foundation of Christian theology were the epistles of Paul, which have been recognized as canon, and placed in the New Testament. The Gospels, or Good News, was the core of the New Testament, and included the story of Jesus himself. Apart from the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, other Gospels were written, like the Gospel of Thomas, which was left out of the canon by the early church leaders. As Jesus was crucified there, Jerusalem became the birthplace of Christianity, but once it was besieged in 70 CE, many Jews and early Christian followers dispersed, establishing churches mainly in major eastern cities. Many of the early Christian communities were from these Greek-speaking regions in the east. Over time, they spread over across Europe and gained followers in the Latin West. The belief was attractive to those living under the heel of the Romans, and gave them something to look forward to, with salvation and afterlife. It also gave them a sense of community, helping those more needy, like orphans or the poor, and a stronger connection against a common oppressor. They never felt like Romans, so took an identity as Christian. It felt familiar as well, as the mystery religions and cults were also concerned with rebirth and forms of eternal life. Whether a rich aristocrat, or a poor slave, man, woman, it did not matter. Christianity viewed all people equally, and as needing salvation. Because the early persecutions were sporadic, Christianity only managed to strengthen during the latter half of the 1st and 2nd century, as they learned ways to organize and communicate, away from Roman eyes. Starting in the mid-200s, the Christian persecutions became more common and more systematic. The most serious one, the Great Persecution, initiated by Emperor Diocletian in 303, was also the last. Though severe, Christianity had gained enough growth and experience to survive, and a decade later, in 313, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which ended the persecution and gave Christianity legal status. In 380, under Theodosius, Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire. For the followers of Christianity, it was a truly miraculous turn of events. But it wasn't long before those in power conducted persecutions of their own, suppressing or assimilating the rich pagan traditions we had come to grow so familiar with. Ironically, Christianity would only begin to shine brightly during the next period, a time known as the Dark Ages.